Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this gorgeous day. Looks like at least one person sounds like they're calling from right on the river, so that sounds like fun. My name is Olivia Uze. I work with the local river subcommittees of the Connecticut River Joint Commission, and the event tonight, Future of Invasive Species Management, is part of our river-wide speaker series, bringing together members from all of the 5 subcommittees along the Connecticut River, part of New Hampshire and Vermont, and hopefully a good amount of residents and people who live within the watershed. So really glad to have this second event as part of the series. And so I'm just going to give a brief kind of introduction to who the Connecticut River Joint Commissions and the subcommittees are. And hopefully, if there are a few members who want to speak up and share a little bit of what they do as members and maybe some of the active activities that people are involved in. And then we'll get straight into our speakers, Amy and Kim, tonight. So I know we're really excited to hear from them. So for those who don't know, the Connecticut River Joint Commissions is a bi-state body, both New Hampshire and Vermont. It was started, I want to say 1989. I'm going to get that wrong. So if somebody has, that's not right, someone speak up. But it's a bi-state commission that focuses on the management of the Connecticut River watershed for its ecological condition, for its recreational capacity, and for its economic success and health. So it's quite a diverse body with stakeholders from a multiplicity of different types of groups, whether they're agriculture or industry or residents or people who work in natural resources and other capacities or conservation-minded groups. So it's quite a diversity. We do management plans, and the local river subcommittees that are split up in 5. So from north to south, with towns, every town that's along the river on both sides of the river gets a chance to comment on permits that come through that are relevant to that region of the subcommittee and the Connecticut River specifically. And, you know, we have a specific kind of call out on New Hampshire side, but we also, when we get the chance, do comment and kind of look at what's happening on the Vermont side as well. So have that dual role. And then when there is an opportunity or interest, subcommittees do take on additional work or topics, whether that's, for example, a septic smart workshop that Matascutney group often does, or water quality sampling that multiple members and volunteers are involved in at the moment. Is there any member or commissioner who is attending tonight who wants to share anything specific that they're working on or excited about? So I will say that this year, the volunteers from almost all of the subcommittees are doing water quality sampling. And so if you're interested in that work, then the final event of the series will be highlighting the results of what they'll be doing and how it relates to green infrastructure. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers for tonight's event, Future of Invasive Species Management. So really excited to have both Kim and Amy join us. Ms. Kimbery Jensen is an environmental scientist with the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. And throughout her career, she has implemented a wide range of applications to protect, conserve, and restore ecosystems and waterways, ranging from managing aquatic invasive species to the installation of green stormwater infrastructure projects to the coordination of public participation for a large-scale EPA cleanup grant on the Housatonic River. Ms. Jensen has networked with landowners, municipalities, partnering agencies, and field professionals to complete sustainable projects that have long-term benefits for their communities. Ms. Jensen holds an undergraduate degree in environmental sciences from SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and a master's degree in the science education from North Vermont University. Great to have you, Kim. Thank you for joining tonight. And our other speaker tonight is Miss Amy Smagula. She is a limnologist with the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, where she coordinates the Exotic Species Program and the state's Lake Regional Monitoring Program. She has a Bachelor of Science in Natural Resources Management and a Master of Science in Water Resource Management, both from the University of New Hampshire. Amy has experience in field and laboratory limnology, aquatic plant and algae identification and management, lake and watershed assessment and management, lake-related policymaking, wetland inspection and permitting, and shoreline protection. Amy serves as editor of Lakeline, a magazine of the North American Lake Management Society. She is also active in the Northeast Aquatic Plant Management Society, the New England chapter of the North American Lake Management Society, and the Northeast Aquatic Nuisance Species Panel. A lot of great experience. I'm really excited to hear what they're going to share with us tonight. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to them and let them share their screen. So.
All right, thanks very much, Olivia, for asking us to do this. Can you guys see my screen?
I can see it, Amy.
Okay, great, thank you. So Kim and I are going to go back and forth with our sharing of the presentation. I'm going to start off. I do also want to say that even though my bio includes a lot of information on lakes, I work fairly evenly with river systems, even though I am defined as a lake biologist, but I do find myself spending a lot of time on rivers and more so on the Connecticut River these days, especially with some of the threats from farther down south, but also the threats in the river that Kim and I are going to cover in our presentation tonight. So the outline of our presentation, we'd like to discuss the area of our focus for tonight's presentation. We'll talk about invasive species of concern. I know from talking with Olivia that some of you have a good idea of some of the invasive species that are out there, but we'll cover a good scope of those. And it will include a mix of riparian or along the riverbanks, as well as in the water itself. Then we'll talk about some prevention activities, early detection, rapid response, and long-term management. Those are the four key elements of an invasive species program that both Vermont and New Hampshire include in our daily activities. And it's also a nationally accepted approach to dealing with invasive species. So I tend to refer to that as our mantra, and it's something that we do often. And then we'll talk about some available resources for you guys so that you can learn more about these things. And then we'll talk about some specific recommendations for how, as a group, you guys could do some activities related to the Connecticut River when it comes to invasive species. So the focus of this presentation, of course, like Olivia outlined, is going to be on the portion of the Connecticut River between Vermont and New Hampshire. We will, of course, talk about some of the threats from both Massachusetts and Connecticut. There is a pretty big threat that some of you guys may have heard about. It's hydrilla. And we don't have it here yet that we've seen, but there is a big emphasis in the region for some of the regional groups that we work with that is focusing on that particular plant. But we'll talk about that one when we get to it. So what are invasives? This is a tricky subject because a lot of people think about something that might be annoying or problematic or unsightly as invasive. And it might just be a nuisance, or it might just be a plant that's okay that is growing a little bit more than we would like it to. But there's actually an official definition for invasives, and that is something that is a non-native to a particular area, meaning that it hasn't evolved here over time and we can't trace it back to natural roots in our region. And then the fact that it's also a nuisance species, it causes problems. So a non-native plus a nuisance equals an invasive. And some of those problems are economic issues or harm to human health or harm to the ecology of an area. So those are some documented issues that really cause something to be classified as an invasive. Some of the really big poster children, I guess you could call them, for invasive species that might be evident to some of you are Japanese knotweed, zebra mussels, the emerald ash borer, which is receiving a lot of press lately. About 10 years ago, the hemlock woolly adelgid was really talked about. Then we finally started seeing it showing up in our area. And then Eurasian water milfoil. Now, when you look at this picture or this slide, you can see that this covers a whole range of things. We've got terrestrial plants, we've got animals that are underwater, plants that are underwater, insects, and tree pests. So invasive species truly do cover a whole range of organisms. So we have to have a fairly broad approach. And later on in the presentation, Kim and I both have slides that give you contact information for both of our states so that you can reach out based on the type of invasive species that you are seeing or are concerned about, because both states do have different programs for different invasives. So some of the impacts that invasive species have, first is what, as biologists, we're definitely concerned about, and that's ecological impacts. We tend to see a decline in our native species when invasive species come in. Invasive species grow faster, they grow thicker, they grow taller, they're denser, and they can compete with native species, and native species can't keep up. Some of the invasives that we have can grow 6 inches a day. Some of them have thousands of offspring 2 times in a season for a growing cycle. So they can definitely cause impacts. And then when you have a loss of native species and changes, you could have impacts to rare, threatened, and endangered species that we're trying to protect. So it could be pretty devastating. Also, there could be water quality changes. In some of the field work that we do, we have documented that water is warmer in areas where there are dense beds of invasive plants because they can hold heat. Warmer water holds less oxygen. So less oxygen means that fish and mussels and aquatic insects don't do so well. So they all have oxygen tolerances that they need to meet. So water quality changes could occur that could impact across the food web. Also, nutrient changes. If you have large beds of plants or mussels dying off all at once, that could add a lot of nutrients up into the water column, which could cause harmful algal blooms or cyanobacteria blooms. Cyanobacteria are in the water and can produce neurotoxins and liver toxins. So they could cause human health issues and also impacts to aquatic life as well. So pretty broad spectrum there. Not to mention the fact that recreational impacts are there. Boating and fishing is miserable in really thick plant beds. It's hard to paddle. It's hard to get a motorboat through these beds, and fisheries are impacted. And a lot of people who like to open water fish go for the weed beds because that provides habitat. However, when your entire aquatic system is a weed bed, those fish can become stunted and hard to catch and not as valuable in catching. So recreation is impacted there. And then in a system like the Connecticut River farther south of us, or other river systems, or even some of the Great Lakes or other like Lake Champlain or other bigger lake systems, navigation can be impeded. So commercial impacts for the larger ships that come in. Also recreation in general for boaters, navigation in that way can also be impacted. So those are some of the impacts. There are definitely lots more, but those are some of the big ones that we tend to see often. And there are millions of dollars that are spent annually in both Vermont and New Hampshire, and that's for each state. I know that in New Hampshire for aquatic invasive species, we spend about $5 million a year for management, and that's both state and local costs. And I'm sure Vermont is fairly similar. And I see Kim nodding. So this is a list on the Vermont side from surveys that were conducted on the Connecticut River. And this is a list of the aquatic invasive species that were documented. And there are several. You can see the list here and different parts of the river where surveying was done. And those are the most problematic in Vermont. Some of the other reports of invasive species actually include up to 27 total invasive species along the Connecticut River corridor. And that includes a handful of the aquatics that were listed on the previous slide, as well as a number of riparian species or slightly more terrestrial species that are found directly along the river system, like not necessarily in the water, but along the river. So there are several. These maps are both available on our respective state websites. You can see dots showing the distribution of invasive species in Vermont on the left and New Hampshire on the right. I don't know why the northern tip of New Hampshire does not, or the northern half of New Hampshire doesn't have any dots. We just haven't found any invasives there. But if you look at the Vermont map, you can see that they certainly have northern infestations. So the invasive species can definitely grow farther north than the middles of our states. And we each as states have fairly diverse types of invasive species growing in our systems. And those dots are indicative of what they are. So if you want a closer look at those, you can go on our websites and take a closer look. In the Connecticut River, the list that you just saw will show you what species are there. Most of the river throughout the upper part of the states doesn't really have anything for invasives. You might find some more of the riparian species growing along the banks in those parts, but generally it's about the bottom third of the state that typically has the most invasive species concurrently growing in them. In it. So that is the primary area. And you can assume the more development you get, the more people you have moving things around in that part of the state, you will tend to have more invasives introduced. So I'm going to turn it over to Kim now, who is going to actually walk you through the different species that are of concern.
Amy, before we pass it off, I just wanted to point out a question in the chat from Keith Alverson. He says, you mentioned anoxia. I associate this with ponds and lakes and mostly with nutrient loading rather than temperature induced changes. Is anoxia a problem anywhere in the river?
Yes, and that's actually a really good question. So you assume that when you have a river system and you have active flow that you're going to have turbulence, which is going to mix in oxygen. But that's not always the case. When you are off to the margins of the river and into the back part, the back waters of the river that are still actively connected to the river, you can have pretty low oxygen in those areas. So anoxia is very common. And then also in the main stem of the river, if you have locations where you have dams and there is a fair amount of depth held back by those dams, you can reach thermal stratification in those areas where you have a warm topwater layer and a very cold deep water layer. And if that happens and you don't have deep oxygen circulation, you can have anoxia at deep spots in the main stem of the river behind a dam.
Great, thank you. That's all we have in the chat for now.
So we're going to dive in. So Amy and I are aquatic biologists, as was mentioned in the intro. And so we're going to be reviewing some of the aquatic invasive species. We will be reviewing some of the littoral and shoreline species as well, but for this presentation, we thought we would look at the aquatic invasive species. Go ahead. So there's a number of invasive plants in Vermont and New Hampshire, as Amy mentioned in that list. So some of the big contenders that we have in the Connecticut River are Eurasian water milfoil, variable leaf water milfoil, curly leaf pondweed, water chestnut, and brittle naiad. So those are the largest percentages of plants of invasives in the Connecticut River. So Eurasian water milfoil is a big problem in Vermont for sure. One of the ways that you can identify Eurasian water milfoil is those big masses. It's much larger than our native milfoils. They tend to form monocultures as well as all invasives. They tend to form a monoculture. So there's not a structure within a water body. It's just a mass of, basically one height of a plant. And that's one of the main problems for fisheries as well, because fish like those different strata within the water body. You can think of the water as a forest. There's a lot more diversity when there's a lot more structure in the trees and the heights. Same is true within a water body. There's more diversity when you have a more varied structure. So with Eurasian water milfoil, it just forms these really dense stands. And if you were to take that section for which the leaves grow and cut that section, you would get a whorl of a leaf. And this leaf that has 4 leaves per whorl, if you count those leaflets along the stem, there's usually more than 12 or 14 normally, could go up to 22. So that's one characteristic of Eurasian water milfoil that you can identify that particular plant. It also has those reddish stem ends. So that's a real indicator of Eurasian water milfoil. So in Vermont, we have 99 water bodies that have Eurasian water milfoil. And I have seen it all through the Connecticut as well. And in New Hampshire, there's 6. So that's a good thing for Amy. So if you can go to the next. So the next is really Amy's big contender. We don't have a variable water milfoil, fortunately, as much as Amy. So it is very interesting to me that we have the Eurasian water milfoil in Vermont and the variable in New Hampshire. So it's just very interesting to me of why we don't have more variable. So variable water milfoil is similar to Eurasian, and it has the same undergrowth as Eurasian. As you can see, the stems have that feathery appearance, that whorl of leaves, same amount of number. But then at the very, very top, it has a different leaf structure, which is very interesting to me. And that's how it got its name, as variable water milfoil. So it forms almost like a tail at the very top. So that's another way to tell the difference between those 2 species. Curly leaf pondweed is an interesting pondweed species. There's many different types of pondweed species in Vermont and New Hampshire and in the Northeast. The Potamogeton species are multiple and varied, but none look very similar to this curly leaf, this crispy leaf, I like to call it. It very much looks like lasagna noodles along the edge. And so that's really the great identifying feature of it. We have 37 water bodies with Potamogeton crispus in it. And only there's 6 in New Hampshire, which is great. But I believe that in Vermont, it's underreported. This is particularly a species that, for the most part, I haven't seen dense stands of it. It usually seems to be contained within small patches. So I'm not seeing the same effects that it has with Eurasian water milfoil or some of the other major contenders. So that's a good, and then we're also hope that, you know, we can get out and monitor to see indeed how many other water bodies it may be in. So brittle naiad, kind of a new species. It bloomed very significantly last year in Lake Champlain. And it also bloomed in the 9 Vermont water bodies pretty prolifically as well. So I'm not sure if the temperatures that we had last year was just a perfect situation for this particular species to grow. When you pick up the species out of the water, it retains its shape and it's very brittly. It reminds me of a Brillo pad. And the serrations along the leaf is how you can identify the species from other naiad species which are native. So it's very unique and it's very brittle. Water chestnut, this is not much of a problem in the Connecticut, thank goodness. There is a small population in the Brattleboro area that we've been monitoring for quite some time. We have a fabulous patroller, Vermont invasive patroller, Lori Callahan, that asked for volunteers. Some of you that I noticed that were in the workshop today have, I think, been there. So thank you for joining us on the water and today. So Lori Callahan, she really does a great job of monitoring the site. I believe last year we only found 8 species or 8 plants in the water. And that takes a lot of monitoring ability and going through lots and lots of lily pads to find 8 plants in a very large area. So I really appreciate her efforts there. Unfortunately, we did find another new location in the Rockingham area in the fall last year, and it was reported a bit late before we could actually get out there. I had actually just put all my equipment away for the evening, or for the fall, sorry. And we unfortunately didn't see the breadth of the population, but Lori actually went out there and she said there's thousands of plants. So the unfortunate occurrence of that population is going to be monitored for the next 12 to 14 years, because those seed-like capsules that you see that look like little aliens, those can last for 12 to 14 years in the sediment. So it's quite a challenge to eradicate that species, even though we have seen successes in Lake Champlain doing annual harvesting, and we've reduced the population to the southern locations in southern Lake Champlain. But this species is an annual, which is interesting. It's a rosette that floats on the top of the surface, and then it has a very similar structure to Eurasian water milfoil below, and it is rooted. So the best way to harvest that is to actually grab that rosette and kind of reel the rest of the plant in and get the root. So there is a lot of great efforts going on, and this plant is actually throughout the southern reaches of the Connecticut River as well, in Massachusetts and Connecticut. So there's some good work being done for water chestnut in the Connecticut. So I thought I'd just mention a couple of species that each of us have and each of us don't have. So starry stonewort was found in 2015 in Lake Memphremagog. This is a unique plant. It's a macroalgae. Even though it looks like a plant, it's an algae. It has these yellow or white seed-like bulbils, they're called, and that's the best way to identify that species. And Amy, would you like to talk about fanwort?
Sure, this is one you guys don't have yet.
Yeah.
I think your waters might be more alkaline. And to what you were saying earlier about your Eurasian water milfoil and our variable milfoil, from what I understand, it's pH based. So the higher pH water bodies do favor Eurasian water milfoil, and the lower pH water bodies, which we have in New Hampshire, tend to favor the variable. And we do have a couple Eurasian sites, but they are along the Connecticut River, right close to Vermont. So your bedrock is a little bit different than ours. When it comes to fanwort, this one is in southern New Hampshire. It really hasn't expanded more beyond the Massachusetts border portion of our state. This plant is similar to milfoil when you look at it in the water, but when you take it out of the water, it looks very different. Kim was talking about the leaves of the milfoils. The fanwort leaves are definitely arranged differently. The leaves are opposite as opposed to whorled, and it's a well-named plant. It's a fan-shaped leaf, so those leaves are opposite. There are some natives that can look a lot like this. Bladderwort and coontail are just a couple. But the thing with the fanwort is that it has a main stem with a little stem off from it, and then the fan-shaped leaf. So you can see that here. So very distinctive. This one can be very invasive, and like the pictures Kim was showing for the milfoils, take over large areas of growth as well. And they can grow 12 to 13 or 14 feet tall. So the plants are big in the water column.
So this is the species of concern. So hydrilla is and has been found in the Connecticut River in Connecticut. And we have completed some surveys, Amy and I, along the Connecticut River in both our jurisdictions. Unfortunately, we did not find any, and we're gonna knock on wood about that, because we really hope that we don't find it in our waters in the Connecticut River. Hydrilla is unique, and if you take that section, that whorl, you can count the leaves, and there's actually 5 leaves per stem. And it looks very similar to our native species Alodia canadensis, which has 3 leaves per whorl, or sometimes 4 because nature never really does what we want it to do and just stays 3 whorls. So there's also Brazilian Alodia, which Amy has a few locations of, and that's usually 4 leaves per whorl. So this is the big worry that we have with this plant moving up to the Connecticut River through different means and transporting, basically. You're muted, Amy, if you wanted to say something.
Thank you. Just to add to what Kim said, in the surveys that we've been doing along the Connecticut River between New Hampshire and Vermont, there is a lot of native Alodia or waterweed. There are beds of it. So it's a very careful picking through that to count leaf whorls to make sure that they are 3 consistently, maybe the occasional 4, but it's not a consistent thing. So if you guys are out on the river and you're doing any monitoring, just count the leaf whorls. And if you see anything that is consistently 4 or more, that's definitely something we want to know about. But I wanted you guys to know that you will find something that looks a lot like this, but it might not necessarily be the invasive. It alarmed me to start with.
So hydrilla is a significant risk from downstream, and these are some photos of the hydrilla expansion there. So on the left, you can see how dense it can be, and in the middle, you know, just that it rises to the top. Very similar to our native Alodias. You know, as Amy mentioned, it does look very similar. It acts the same way, but it's like our Alodia on steroids. So as you can see on the picture on the right, just those dense stands, you know, really impeding navigation, forming that dense monoculture, and that is what they're dealing with in some locations in Connecticut.
And I also want to say it wasn't to the Connecticut River, but one of the Vermont invasive plant breeder program folks had a piece of milfoil of hydrilla come in on a boat from the Connecticut River in Connecticut, about to be launched into Lake Champlain, and the DNA confirmed it was the same, because the population that's in the Connecticut River in Connecticut is very distinct from any other populations across the US. So it is moving, and a lot of people do use the Connecticut River. So it is something that we are definitely concerned about. It's a valid concern.
So in 2018, when this first occurrence and identification of hydrilla was found in Connecticut, all the panel members within the Northeast Aquatic Nuisance Species Panel went to Connecticut to survey the Connecticut River and attempted to find all the locations of where this plant was. We were hoping it was in a small contained area, and unfortunately that was not the case. It was found throughout the entire segment of the Connecticut River in Connecticut, and you can see that, I believe, in the red dots on the left, and then I think on the red dots on the right as well. So we have a lot of work to do, and we have been working with the state of Connecticut, to increase the ability to provide some funds for the state to do some efforts on trying to manage this population, and Amy will talk about that in a little bit. So we also have some aquatic invasive animals to deal with. Fortunately, there's none in the Connecticut River, potentially maybe except for the rusty crayfish. So the left picture of the fish is the alewife, and there was actually a picture of alewife that had died back. So sometimes in the fall or spring, there's a huge die-off of fish in Lake Champlain, and that is due to the alewife that is located there, that we think that was brought in by someone with bait fish that was actually stocking the water. So that's one that's something hard to get rid of, even though it is impacted by cold waters and has these huge die-offs. It doesn't completely kill them all. The rusty crayfish that I just mentioned, that is an invasive species. Again, I think this species is underreported. In Vermont, we just don't have the ability to go out to all of our rivers to sample to see if they're present. The rusty crayfish is unique, and it has two red patches on its carapace. And it's kind of like if you were to pick it up, there's two little red patches there. And it's quite brown compared to the blue clawed native crayfish. On the right, of course, is zebra mussels. Everybody should probably be familiar with that. What that looks like, it has those bands on the shell, and it also can stand on its edge because one of the edges of the shell is very straight. Then we have on the left the spiny and fishhook water fleas. So there's a picture of one individual species, and then along that line, there's several tens of that species along the line, and then that glob is a whole population mass of them. So those are found in Lake Champlain. And then the Asian clam, we do have one water body that has the Asian clam in Bombazine, and we think that was an aquarium dump. And the way that you can identify Asian clam is because of those concentric bands along the shell, and it also has ridges along the shell. So that is one identifying feature. So the unique thing about mussels, and one of the main reasons why it's very difficult to manage mussels once they are in a water body is because of their ability to reproduce tremendously. So again, just looking at the features of these two different mussel species, you have the zebra mussels on the top, which has a really nice zebra-like stripes on it, and then the quaggas below are really round. We hope we don't get those in Vermont. We're hoping that it just stays at bay due to low calcium levels in most of our water bodies, which is really keeping out even zebra mussels in some areas. So for these mussels to reproduce and to grow, they need levels around 13 parts per million of calcium, and a lot of our waters are about 9. So we're fortunate to have that limit. And Amy, I'm not sure how your waters are, by the way.
Oh, calcium levels in New Hampshire are much lower. I think maybe 1 to 5 milligrams per liter. So really, really low, well beyond the threshold. We did, with that said, we did identify 27 water bodies that could potentially support zebra or quagga mussels. And those were along the Connecticut River, of course, with more calcium than we see in the rest of the state. And then some portions along the southern reach of the state where we do have a lot of urban runoff that provides other things beyond calcium, like a lot of algal growth and other conditions. So not many sites, a few possible, just like Vermont.
So along the banks, I think this is probably what folks here are concerned with. We have a number of invasive species listed here today. And these are more of a challenge, unfortunately, than the aquatics in some cases because it's so prolific. I noticed in the chat, there's a question about loosestrife, and I believe the next slide, we'll actually look at some of those species as well. And then along the banks, and then there's also littoral species. So purple loosestrife, I just wanted to get to that person's question. Great effort in trying to remove purple loosestrife, and there's great effort to remove all of these species listed here and in the former slide and in the next slide, I think too. And it is unfortunate that there's just not a lot of funding for removal of invasive species. I think the majority of efforts to manage invasive species and all of these species that we're dealing with is really on the homeowner or the municipality and volunteers and people who are concerned citizens to manage and in hope of eradication. So there is this philosophy of letting invasives kind of coexist with natives. And I think there's a book that's been out recently because I've been seeing this a lot about species just coexisting and letting things just kind of compete with one another. And there was actually a recent publication of Eurasian water milfoil efforts and the management efforts over 20 years and comparing water bodies that were managed compared to water bodies that were not managed. And they see these extremes of populations going up and down and the natives going up and down with those populations of the Eurasian water milfoil. And eventually it kind of ends up at the same place as the managed. So as we kind of rethink what these ideas are, we also have to understand that there are those major effects. As Amy pointed out earlier, there's economic effects, there's recreational impacts, there's habitat and native effects. So what we as managers are attempting to do is try to figure out what is that best fit for those particular species. With loosestrife, you know, I'm from central New York originally, and in many places, loosestrife was never managed, and that is the only species that is in many of the wetlands. So I'm under the philosophy, if I take off my state hat, that if you find a small population that can be eradicated, then do it. You know, that is really the best bet. We don't want to allow these things to become so prolific that they form these dense stands, because it does have a huge negative impact over time. And you skipped a slide. Oh, yeah, that's going to go ahead. Okay. Go for it, Amy.
Okay, and so addressing the problems of invasives. So both states have programs that are very similar. And as I said at the beginning, the mantra, if you will, is prevention, early detection, rapid response, and long-term management. And it's a progression or a continuum. And we want to be more on this side of that progression as opposed to over here. Not only because this is easier to do and to address, and it's cheaper than being over here where you have a really big infestation and you have to do a lot of very intensive management for multiple years that costs thousands and thousands of dollars. So when we're dealing with new infestations, it's best to either try to prevent them or find them early. And when you do find them early, respond quickly so that you have the best luck at management, just exactly like Kim said. And then we move into long-term management if we get beyond this scope. And that's what this graph here shows, is that as you move along this continuum with more time that you wait before you try to prevent a new infestation or before you seek to eradicate it, the bigger the control cost, the bigger the area of infestation, and then you're just in it for the long haul. And with that said, the Connecticut River already does have a number of invasive species in it and along it. However, there are more that are coming. As the climate is warming, as the record number of boaters, given last year's boat buy-up across the country, there are more people that are moving about between water bodies, and they could potentially be bringing different invasive species in. So even though the Connecticut River is in that position where you do have invasives, you're still very much along this continuum for anything else that could be coming your way. So there's always an opportunity to prevent a new infestation, to try to eradicate an infestation, and so on. So you always want to keep that in mind. So in the prevention realm, there are a lot of different things that you can do. Being state employees in both states, Kim and I deal in the regulatory platform, even though we're both biologists, and our programs are defined by regulating invasive species with the thought that we can help prevent their overland spread and distribution. So the question was just asked about purple loosestrife, and Kim was talking about it. Purple loosestrife was both an intentional and accidental introduction in the late 1800s. And the accidental portion was seeds were caught in wool products that were brought over, and purposeful with people bringing plants and seeds over to plant. Up until about 15 years ago in New Hampshire, at least, and probably Vermont, you could go to a garden center and buy purple loosestrife. So with these regulations, we're trying to prevent known invasive species from being sold and planted across the landscape. So prohibiting the sale, the distribution, and even with boaters, importing them or introducing them into a water body are all regulated activities. And in fact, in both states, in Vermont and New Hampshire, it's illegal to transport any aquatic plants, whether they're invasive or not. And that just takes away the identification factor. If it's green, take it off. We don't want it moving around. Then we use rules to include species lists in them so that they have a little bit more teeth. And then those rules also further define the laws that are on the books. There are local ordinances in different parts of each of our states. Some of those really commonly are requiring a boater to use a wash station. That should say wash, not was. A wash station before launching into any water body in a given town. So we have a couple of those around. There could also be other local ordinances that pertain to invasive species, which are useful on the local level where they could be potentially more easily enforced. And then there could be different advisories or use restrictions about water bodies. If they become infested, portions of them could be quarantined, or access to a water body could be completely restricted in some cases. So regulatory endeavors when it comes to prevention are useful in the bigger, larger framework. So then for spread prevention, there's lots of education and outreach. The more people that we can reach, the better. And this is probably very similar for what Kim sees. We aren't as worried about the informed citizen that's, up to speed on invasive species or as part of a group like you are with the Connecticut River group. Not even the bass angler groups where a lot of people tend to point fingers for moving invasive species. Those folks are pretty meticulous about their gear and make sure everything is clean before they enter another water body. It's that everyday weekend boater, not affiliated with a lake or a group or a river, and they don't really know about this stuff. So we try to create as many pamphlets and educational materials. We have different signs at boat launches trying to inform boaters to make sure that they are cleaning their gear. Clean, drain, dry is the message that we promote. So any way we can get the word out. You guys are an organized group and we're giving a presentation to you. It's really hard to give a presentation to the weekend boater. It's hard to pin them down if they're not associated with someone. So any ideas for education are certainly welcome. We did create specific signs. So we have typical signs for each of our states, but we actually have a sign that's specific to the Connecticut River. And if you guys go to a boat launch along the Connecticut and you don't see a sign like this, please let me or Kim know. We have some signs that we can share with you. As Kim mentioned earlier, she and I are both part of the Northeast Aquatic Nuisance Species Panel, which brings in member states from throughout the Northeast so that we can collaborate around an issue or around different activities related to invasive species. So this sign is a result of all of the New England states banding together, including New York, so Northeastern perspective, to create signage and to spread the word about invasives in the Connecticut River, specifically hydrilla.
Amy, I had a quick question.
Yeah.
Do you distribute any of your pamphlets at local retailers, like people who are buying new boats or used boats, or even at, I don't know if there's many in the Connecticut River, but at, among the lakes and ponds at joint docking stations? I'm just curious about some of those strategies.
Yep, so we do make all of our pamphlets available to anybody who wants them. We also include them at rest areas, tourist rest areas, so that transient boaters can pick them up. So when you go in and you have all those rack holders with all the cards, you can find things there. We have distributed information to bait dealers, to marina operators, boat retailers. I know in New Hampshire and probably in Vermont, and I'll let Kim answer this one, we have the Marine Trades Association that represents all of the marina operators in the state. So we give regular presentations to them and then share materials and signage with them. Kim, do you have a similar group in Vermont?
We do, but so far they haven't been, welcoming of us telling them what to do. So that's still a population that we have yet to crack.
Okay.
I did get some requests this year, so we're hoping that this year we're reaching that 20% of the population that we're still not reaching. with the efforts that for education and outreach.
Okay, yeah, it's different in New Hampshire. They're very receptive and very happy to work with us. And I actually just learned yesterday that New England Marine Trade Dealers Group has just formed. So hopefully with interstate partnerships and them sharing information, the messaging about invasive species will grow. Their efforts were centered around the wake boat industry and ballast for those boats moving invasives around. So we can certainly try to pump information through them. But yeah, Olivia, any group that is interested in having pamphlets or materials, we're glad to share. We don't necessarily do mass mailings to groups automatically because we don't know if they want them. But certainly visitor areas, visitor centers, rest areas, and any shop that asks for stuff, we'll send stuff out to. So another important thing that we study nationally is looking at identifying different pathways of invasives. And there are many. Invasive species spread in a lot of different ways. Most of the animals that we had come in that Kim went through, a lot of them came in through ballast water discharges from large ships. And then those found their way through canals or overland transport by boaters moving things around. And I want to say this is a really dramatic photo. It literally takes a few inches of a stem of a plant to cause a new infestation. So it doesn't need to be this dramatic looking. It can just be a very small plant. Kim also mentioned an aquarium dump when she was talking about the Asian clam in Lake Bomazene. We do believe that a lot of invasive plants and animals were introduced that way. The Brazilian waterweed that Kim mentioned, that's in New Hampshire, we do believe came from an aquarium dump. It was a very urban pond, not one that has transient boaters. And there happened to be a pet store right down the road. So we don't know if they were dumping some stuff or if a homeowner possibly dumped something. I already mentioned home gardening as a source of spread, and then illegal stocking. We call these bucket biologists who move things around and introduce fish to lakes where they want them, where they may not have originally been. So we try to work on a lot of levels with identifying these different pathways and trying to break those pathways so that they're not spreading invasive species. And for the transient boater, both states have public access greeter program in Vermont and what we call the Lake Coast program in New Hampshire. And these folks are great because they do courtesy boat inspections to make sure that boats are cleaned off before they're launched and after they leave the water. And then they also educate the boater about the invasive species issue. So they are worth their weight in gold because they are so valuable at helping out here. These are the folks that really interact with that weekend transient boater that I mentioned. That's a really hard group to get at. And we saw from our data in New Hampshire that the rate of spread has actually decreased significantly with each year of the program being active. So it really does help. And this is something that we should really try to look at implementing up and down the Connecticut River. And Kim and I have been talking about this for a while as something that we'd love to see happening at boat launches along the Connecticut, just so that we can try to limit the spread of things leaving the river and anything new coming into the river. A stepped up level of that is having watercraft decontamination stations. So the best ones are high pressure, high temperature, and temperature being over 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's a really hard thing to achieve. But if you just have simple power wash stations, that at least will help blast off some material that is associated with attachment to boats, trailers, and other recreational gear. With that said, you need to have placement correctly. You don't want to have these things where if you're cleaning off a boat, it drains right into a lake. So you want to make sure you move this system so that the slope is away. And here you can see the boat launch is sloped this way, but it looks like the pavement is sloped this way. So you're moving away from the lake with any drainage that comes off those vessels. And then even something as simple as a trash can with a sign on it that says dump invasives here, or be sure to clean, drain, dry, and leave materials here. That's useful. So these different things exist in Vermont. We have a CD3, which is a decontamination station that we have that's mobile in New Hampshire. moving between water bodies to help with that effort. And that's something that we'd like to see grow between the two states and try to get more of those stations around. The early detection component is a lot of eyes on the water. And Kim and I are out a lot as biologists, and there are other biologists in both states that do a lot of monitoring, but we can't be everywhere. We each have upwards of 1,000 water bodies in each state for lakes and ponds, and thousands of miles of rivers and streams. So we love our volunteers, and volunteers really do make a difference. And these are just some folks that are out looking at different water bodies, monitoring for invasives, and reporting those if they do find anything that's suspicious. And Kim and I both do trainings for groups to help identify invasive species and to know what to look for and what to report. And we also have invasive mussel monitoring programs or clam monitoring programs for things like Asian clam and zebra mussel.
Amy, there are two comments in the chat that I wanted to mention really quick.
Of course.
One going back to the discussion about retailers and marina operators. Peter says that both that he's received material on invasive transport from those folks, but boats are slippery and easy to clean, but that trailers seem designed to snag aquatic vegetation and then release it in the next water.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you could easily sandwich plants between a boat and the bunks or rollers of a trailer, which would be hard to remove. And the water chestnut that Kim talked about, that easily sticks into the carpeted bunks of boat trailers. So they are very difficult to deal with.
There's also a question from Kathy Erfer who says, can you suggest a good small identification booklet, maybe among the ones you mentioned earlier, that you can carry in a canoe or a kayak? Oh, I see Kim showing something on her screen.
Even though it's backwards, this is a really good book that I put in the chat box, and it's a new, it's third edition, but I think it's a fourth edition. It just has some really great photographs. It has identifying features. It's a really good aquatic guide to use. So I recommend this guide.
I have a list of books that I think are useful. Olivia, I'll send them to you. And if you don't mind distributing it to the membership or to the attendees, that would be great.
Yeah, no problem. I'll make sure that's in the follow-up.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Yeah, we also have Aquatic Plants and Algae of New Hampshire's Lakes and Ponds book that would be very relevant to both Vermont and New Hampshire, as well as to rivers, not just lakes. So I will send the URL for that. And you can also email me if you want a copy of that book. They're only $5.
And we just developed a new key of common aquatic plants in Vermont. So that's also available through our website.
So yeah, there are lots of tools out there for invasive ID, and I'll talk about how to get a hold of us for ID too if you want some help. So rapid response. So if you can prevent, that's great. If you can detect early, that's great. If you do early detection, we will immediately do rapid response. And what that means is that we will quickly respond to new infestations. So most agencies, so in Vermont, it's Kim, and in New Hampshire, it's me. And like I said, a lot of water bodies to get around to. So we do ask for voucher specimens. So if you're out and about and you find something that's remotely suspicious, we ask that you send us photographs or specimens for identification. And then we can figure out if it's something that we need to respond to quickly. That's just sort of helpful in triaging some of these things. And upon verification, staff biologists will conduct a full site inspection to map the extent of the growth and just see what's best in terms of management. And then we'll determine the most appropriate control actions, and we will pursue those for management. Sometimes that could be biologists diving in, like literally diving into your lake or river and doing hand removal. Sometimes it might involve hiring a contractor to come in and do a larger scale management. But when you get a copy of this presentation, you can email me or Kim with voucher specimens. If you do send us photographs, we recommend putting whatever you have on a piece of white paper or a paper towel and put a coin or pen or ruler in there for scale so that we have a good idea of how big it is, big of a specimen it is. This is just an idea of the different mapping that we do between the two states. So we have a couple different types of mapping. Sometimes we just simply boat up and down the shoreline areas, and this is what we were doing in the Connecticut River. We would boat up and down the river and we would click waypoints every time we saw an invasive species. So these flags here are indicating where we saw the invasives. And this is actually a dive flag. So this means that we're going to have divers go in and follow up on those areas. This is a grid pattern of points. So it's called a point intercept survey, where we will literally boat to each of these points and do a rake toss or a quadrat sample, where we look at a square at the bottom of the river and identify the plants in there. It's very systematic. It takes a lot of time, but if we're trying to really identify populations of plants and density and other metrics, that's what we would use. So GPS and GIS experience is very useful. And we use these maps to guide management. So coming back to this photograph here, we have diving activities taking place here. And this is an indicator for an herbicide treatment on this shoreline because the plants are way too thick to pull. This is an example of the European naiad between Maine and New Hampshire that Kim mentioned. So that is what's going on there. And then we can use maps to also delineate areas of density by different colors or different plant groups by different colors. So we do a lot of mapping and different types of mapping.
And Amy, I just wanted to mention that map is a drone map. So that's what we started to incorporate in Vermont, is doing drone surveys to try to identify the amount of material per site. So those will help us in our, not only our monitoring efforts, but also our harvesting efforts as well.
That's very cool, and I want to talk to you about that. Okay, so if we do have an infestation, we typically develop a long-term management plan for it. And that involves assessing the system, determining its uses, and what the ultimate goals are for management. Are we trying to eradicate? Are we trying to do containment? Are we trying to do long-term management to reduce the density to a point where it's not impeding navigation or causing ecological impacts? So the long-term management plans are prepared by the state or by a contractor, and they outline a plan usually over the course of 5 years for long-term management. And they're very helpful, so we can revisit infestations and double check on them. They involve incorporating a lot of the maps that we have and water quality assessments. They're fairly comprehensive and they're very useful documents. And then elements of a management program. How do we tackle an infestation? All infested water bodies with that long-term management plan have an outline of activities each year that will take place based on the infestation. Now, understanding that our water bodies are natural systems and invasive species are adaptive, we have to assess regularly. Monitoring is really important, and we have to adapt our techniques based on what we're seeing real time in these systems. So we do work with municipalities, lake and river associations, and that partnership is really necessary for continuous monitoring management. Also funding in-kind services, every part of the project. We do try to use integrated pest management strategies when possible, and that means using the most appropriate approach given the infestation and the sequence of approaches. And then I already mentioned the adaptive management piece. And luckily, we do have a lot of techniques that are available to us. This is sort of a continuum, I guess, if you look at it that way. We try to contain and quarantine infestations when we find them so they don't spread to additional sites. This could be, in New Hampshire, we have something called restricted use areas where we can buoy off an area and prevent boaters from going into those zones so they're not chopping things up and moving them. Kim, do you have something similar in Vermont, or can you quarantine in Vermont?
We have quarantined in Vermont, but it's been a rare case that we use that technique. It's
Okay.
actually used more so with present infestations and when a management practice is occurring.
Okay, yeah, we can't quarantine a water body in New Hampshire, but we can restrict uses in a small area of a water body if it's an isolated infestation. Moving on to physical controls, we can hand remove them, pick them, we can capture and remove, we can put benthic barriers in to try to smother out or block sunlight from species, or block oxygen to species if there are clams or mussels on the bottom. So physical controls are just what they sound. You're physically doing some type of management. Mechanical controls involve cutting, dredging, digging. These could also include sort of a stepped up approach at diving where you have a diver assisted suction harvester. You're not suctioning the bottom sediments, but you have a diver hand picking plants and feeding them up a suction tube, which is helpful for larger areas that are being dived on. And then we have chemical controls. These are species specific, herbicides, pesticides, insecticides, fungicides, and molluscicides. There are herbicides and other chemicals that are specific down to variable milfoil versus Eurasian water milfoil. So you can get pretty specific and target only those invasives that you want to get rid of. So you're not killing off the entire plant population that might be native. So you're retaining that. It gets a little bit harder when you're getting into the animal world. It gets a little bit harder for specific products to work on specific species. So widespread use of animal pesticides hasn't really happened in lakes very much, but we do use herbicides pretty selectively to control invasive species. And then biological controls. These are advanced in some areas, but not in others. We have really good biological control on things like purple loosestrife, where we introduce the Galarosella beetle to control purple loosestrife populations. And those beetles are leaf-eating beetles, so they mine holes in the leaves of the purple loosestrife. The plant can't photosynthesize really well, and it is going to eventually die after a couple of seasons of this grazing. Now, not to get sci-fi, but for biocontrol, we want to have almost the perfect predator that would rather die than eat anything else but the plant it's intended to eat. That way you're not going to have your tomato plants or your rose bushes or other things that are eaten by these things. So it takes a lot of time to develop these, and that's why we don't have a lot of advancements in this field as of yet. So the example that I just gave with the purple loosestrife, it took Cornell University 14 years to develop the Galarosella beetle, or to identify it and test it. They started off with 122 bugs from across Europe and whittled that down to just 4 species that would rather die than eat anything else but the purple loosestrife. So as you can see, it takes a long time to get this right. And it's very important that we get biological controls right. For a lot of the invasive species that Kim went through, we really don't have biological controls for those. So it is something that advances in science would be useful in that area. And I just want to say that one size does not fit all for these different techniques. There's a time and a place for each. And that's where best professional judgment and scientific experience helps to select which technique is best based on the size, density, scale, type of infestation. Just a couple more slides left. I just wanted to point out some of the different online resources that are available. Both the Department of Environmental Conservation in Vermont and the Department of Environmental Services in New Hampshire have specific web pages on invasive aquatic species, so that you can go there and learn more about those. And then the US Geological Survey has a really good website on lots of different invasive species. They have some really cool maps that show you the actual distribution across the country. And then they have little write-ups about each of the different species. So we encourage you to go take a look at that. One of the tools that we have in New Hampshire is the DES Lake Mapper. It does also include rivers. And in fact, I've got a shot here of a portion of the Connecticut River. So if you type in this URL, which is very long, or you simply go to Google and type DES Lake Mapper, you will get a picture that looks like this. And then if you zoom in on it, you can click on whatever water body of interest you have. And then it will pop up with this dialog box, and it will show you the water body, the different invasive species that we have in there. And then if you scroll down, there'll be lots of different reports and other information in there, so you can learn about the different species. So this is just a tool that you can use for New Hampshire water bodies to go in and look at this. Kim, do you have something similar in Vermont?
We have the lake scorecard, which shows the lakes and water bodies throughout Vermont that have been surveyed in some capacity, whether that's through water quality monitoring efforts, aquatic invasive species, mercury testing. But unfortunately, that is not the case for the rivers. We do have rivers that are sampled for macroinvertebrates and for those same water quality monitoring, but it's not really mapped yet. So that's what we're working on developing, is how to get that information to laypersons.
Okay, and just some resources for you guys. As I said earlier at the beginning of the presentation, different invasive species have different programs in each of our states and different contact people, so that you can get to the specialist in whatever realm the invasive species is that you are looking at. So this is just a list of programs and contacts in New Hampshire. So if you are looking at invasive aquatic plants, it would be me. Our Department of Agriculture deals with invasive riparian and terrestrial species and insects. So that would be Doug Saigan. And then our Fish and Game Department deals with any invasive aquatic animal on land or in water. So the alewife, the spiny water flea, the zebra mussel, all of those would be Scott Decker at the Fish and Game Department. And then in Vermont, Kim is the contact for aquatic invasive plants and animals. If you are looking at fish or invertebrates, those two would be to the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. And then forest insects, terrestrial invasive plants would go to Elizabeth Spinney with Vermont Forest Parks and Rec. And then invasive insects to Ginger Nickerson, also with the same program. And then anything on the noxious weed list would go to Judy Rosofsky at the Vermont Agency of Agriculture. So hopefully these contacts are useful. I'm sure that if you mistakenly reached one of us, we would direct you to the right person for the invasive species of interest. So now we come to the specific recommendations for the Connecticut River. Kim and I, while we were spending hours on a boat together up and down the Connecticut River, we're talking about some of these things. And our recommendations are to monitor for invasives and report anything suspicious to state contacts. Even if you think we know about them, it's just a good idea to let us know, just so that they're on our radar. We also recommend working as a partnership to seek funding for and to implement a boat launch steward monitoring program. As we said through the presentation, it's really important to educate transient boaters and to conduct courtesy boat inspections. So it's a good idea to start something like that. Even if it's a small pilot project at a few boat launches to start with, it's useful, maybe the most popular or highly used boat launches. We also want to recommend expanding the disinfection and decontamination stations. So these are the power wash stations or boat wash stations that are available along the Connecticut River, or at least coming up with some resources to point boaters to car washes so they can go get some degree of washing before they launch. And then to work with partners, state, federal, association, regional partners, to raise some funding for not only managing existing infestations along the river, but also any efforts for prevention, early detection, rapid response. And I can tell you that the Northeast Aquatic Nuisance Species panel that Kim and I are part of is talking about trying to obtain some federal funding for management of the hydrilla in the river system in Connecticut and the tiny patch that's in Massachusetts, so that we can mitigate that, so we can try to reduce the spread of that further north. Even boaters that are going upriver with a boat can move these things upriver. So it's not necessarily going to happen on its own, but it could. These plants kind of creep in crazy ways. So those are our specific resources to consider for the Connecticut River as a whole. And with that, we are happy to take questions or have discussion about some of these species. And I know we're close on time. I'm sorry, we had a lot of slides.
All right, thank you so much, Amy and Kim. That was really a lot of information and things to digest. But if I see, yeah, one person has their hand raised. I'm trying to find who you are. Suzanne, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question or comment.
I think that was a hand clap and not a,
oh, it's
not
a hand clap.
up.
I'm sorry.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Good. If anyone has a question, you can raise your hand or you can just unmute yourself and say something if you'd like.
Hey, good evening all. I just wanted to, I just wanted for the CRJC to know that the New Hampshire Lakes is kind of a lead on setting the example of how to set up these sort of, you know, boat wash stations and greeter programs, at least from my sense with who I've, you know, who I've been interacting with. And so, I think it would be great if there's the opportunity for the various CRJC subcommittees to like sort of take this on as a particular like specific volunteer program to try to identify folks to set up a schedule to, you know, do some sort of greeter program at the boat launches on the Connecticut. Just a suggestion. And Olivia knows one of many that come from me.
Yeah, I think I wanted to just second that notion. You know, Amy and I have certainly talked about it. We both have funding that would support that effort, but we certainly need some local help with, you know, developing, you know, where volunteers may come from or even potential staff may come from to staff the stations or greeter programs along the Connecticut. So, you know, and there's also maybe additional federal funds too that Amy and I can seek to support those efforts. And I also just wanted to point out in the next few years, I have it on my roster to-do list to develop a Vermont statewide aquatic nuisance species plan. So we have one for Lake Champlain, but we don't have one for the state. And I would include the Connecticut River within that plan and work with Amy to develop that too. So those are all coming down the pike in the future, but certainly identifying local partners who may be interested in hosting these greeter programs or boat steward programs would be really helpful for both of us.
I have a question. Going back to your slide that talked about the different types of methods that you can use in the long-term management or even rapid response. One thing that often comes by way of the subcommittees is permits that use herbicides or usually it's an herbicide or a pesticide. Actually, it's usually an herbicide. You know, a common one is glyphosate, among others. And my question is, do you have any recommendations on how to evaluate whether or not those applicants are doing their due diligence in relation to the different options available. Sometimes they don't give a lot of detail on why they're choosing that method over another. And so the question comes up about, is this the right method? Is this necessary? So I was just, if you had any thoughts about those types of review or anything there.
So I can start for New Hampshire. So if you're seeing projects come through on the New Hampshire side, they were all vetted by me doing the field survey work. And my judgment call is based on my experience with plant density distribution and what would work best. So if we go to the herbicide option, it's because the other options aren't going to work. So we've usually tried diving benthic barriers or other techniques. And this is for public water bodies. It's not, private farm ponds or private swimming holes. These are water bodies greater than 10 acres in size for lakes and ponds and larger river systems. So that's coming typically from our survey work and the science behind it. You will probably see some smaller scale projects that come through that don't have that backing, and those would be ones that I would definitely question. Kim and I attend a lot of regional meetings where we are pretty trained in which technique to use, and it's also years of judgment calls when it comes to seeing what works and what doesn't work. So usually all that's vetted. And the New Hampshire applications also ask for what other techniques have been tried in the past.
Yeah, same is true in Vermont. We do ask that people apply to the permitting program when they are thinking about herbicides, and part of the application is, have you tried everything else? And Amy talked about the integrated pest management plan, and we look at all of the different tools and trying to utilize all of those tools before we just use herbicide. So you mentioned glyphosate, and that's really more of a terrestrial herbicide. And I think on a small scale, especially looking at some of those riparian species, that's really the herbicide that's used for that kind of management. And I think that's something that we struggle with in Vermont, is a lot of landowners who may be using a drugstore variety herbicides. And that's really something that we don't enforce because we don't often know about it when it's happening. We do try to inform people that if they are going to use chemicals or herbicides along riparian areas, that they follow the guidelines in the herbicide labels, and they let us know when they're going to do that. The Agency of Agriculture and myself and the other people that were listed in that list all should be informed if there is going to be a management operation of an invasive species that's on a large scale. And so we try to understand when those projects are taking place with partners, but it is very difficult to be sure that a private landowner is herbicides adequately and safely.
All right, thank you. That's really helpful. So I think we're at time, but I make sure that both Kim and Amy's contacts and hopefully the slides, if you are okay with sharing them, are in the follow-up email. So if you have any questions, you'll have their contact information to ask them directly afterwards. But thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you so much, especially to both Kim and Amy, for coming and joining us, and everyone participating on this sunny day.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for inviting us. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Have a great evening.
You too.